Since the Black Lives Matter movement at the latest, public memory has been highly contested again. Around the world, activists are toppling monuments, demanding the renaming of streets, intervening in historical narratives, and imagining other memorials.
My colleague, Nora Sternfeld, Professor of Art Education here at the HFBK, I say HFBK, not HFBK, I hope it's okay, and I, Michaela Melián, Professor of Time-Related Media here at the House, have been dealing with the historical political interventions at the intersection of art, theory, and activism for many years in different places and different projects. When we found ourselves as professors at the HFBK Hamburg in 2020, we developed the idea for a joint seminar on the history of artistic counter-monuments and forms of protest, on aesthetics of memory and historical manifestations in public space, and to ask about para-monuments for the present. Based on this seminar, which Nora and I conducted in the past summer semester, this conference, Counter-Monuments and Para-Monuments, Contested Memory in Public Space, will take place here at the Hochschule für Bildende Künste Hamburg, which will be dedicated to debates about monuments in public space and related aesthetics and politics of remembrance.
Our aim is to bring together different knowledges as well as artistic and activist strategies from the fields of anti-fascist memory politics, anti-racist memorial demands, and decolonial iconoclasms, and to think together about the possibilities, the pitfalls, and the urgencies of memory for the future. For this endeavor, we have invited Heba Amin, Ulf Aminde, Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock, Max Czolek, Talia Feldmann, Eduard Freudmann, Klaas Gefroy, Julia Friedrich, Ayşe Güleç, Minna Henriksson, Lee Hilscher, Leon Kahane, Martin Krenn, Tanja Mancheno, Olu Oguibe, Daniela Ortiz, Anja Steidinger, Stefan Trüby, and Mirjam Zadoff. And we are pleased that all of them accepted our invitation to Hamburg.
We want to address memory as remembering, as an active process, and we want to talk about what art and artistic interventions can achieve in memorial work. We want to do this from a historical, political, as well as from a critical, aesthetic, artistic perspective.
We take an approach that is aware that memory is always contested and disputed. To do this, let's go back into the history of struggles over memory. In the attempt to trace the histories of cultures of remembrance in the post-Nazi German-speaking states, we get insights into a contested terrain. Thus, for a long time, monuments and memorials in cautionary remembrance of Nazi mass crimes were controversial in both West Germany as well as in Austria and East Germany. For many years after the liberation, the burden of remembering the Holocaust in the post-Nazi states fell primarily on the survivors and their relatives. In this respect, addressing Nazi crimes through aesthetic means had already begun in 1945. Survivors advanced it through largely marginalized, self-organized efforts. Under the maxim "never forget," survivor organizations continually worked on commemorative projects. On April 11, 1951, there was a KZ-Verband concentration camp association rally at the Mortenplatz Square in Vienna, the site of the Gestapo jail and the former Hotel Metropole. So what we see here is, of course, not 1951, but in 1951, a similar monument has been placed at the Mortenplatz. During the event, a memorial stone to the Gestapo's victims, dedicated and designed by the Survivors Association, was erected without official permission hence illegally. It was unveiled and immediately dismantled and taken away by the authorities. And it was not until the 1980s that the working group of concentration camp associations and resistance fighters of Austria was able to unveil the new memorial to the victims of the Nazi tyranny. Memory had to be fought for, and it was hard won.
In Germany, the official culture of remembrance and the associated discourse has developed over many decades. Since the reunification of the two German states a little more than 30 years ago, the debates about how to deal with history have taken a new urgency for society as a whole. This also has to do with the fact that hardly any contemporary witnesses of the Shoah are still alive, and at the same time right-wing discourses and racially motivated acts of violence, such as those of the NSU, have massively increased. Against this background, the accusation is formulated from various sides that Germany has made itself too comfortable in the mode of coming to terms with the past and has ignored current developments. Moreover, a post-colonial perspective on memory politics should be taken into account today. So often, artists are delegated to socio-political task of finding new forms for memory, or researching with new means, media, and procedures. At best, artistic works can touch, stir, provoke, or arouse curiosity without at the same time formulating learning goals. They can document or store processes and at the same time make them experienceable again. They can update them and also question them or pose questions anew.
When we asked ourselves what art can do in the politics of history, we would name three potentials of artistic memory work. First, art has no claim to be neutral. It takes a stance and presents it. For that reason, artistic interventions were and are important elements in the struggle over remembrance. Second, art has an emotional dimension. It creates forms that forge links between what has happened and what could happen, and above all, raise questions as to what this means for the present. Third, art has the potential to act as a critical intermediary between participation and estrangement. It definitely involves a history of reflexiveness, the invitation to square up to things. For us, counter-monuments and para-monuments are an artistic expression of these elements. They take a stance against the hegemonic historical narratives and at the same time open up spaces for critical interaction. They do not legitimate what is and instead ask whom history belongs to and put this up for discussion in a radical democratic sense.
We have chosen photos from Annette Wehrmann's series Blumensprengungen as the motive for the conference. The Blumensprengungen took place in the early 1990s as actions in public space in Hamburg and are among Wehrmann's best-known works. The photo series for this project is not only a documentation of the blasting actions, but also forms its own artistic work complex. The former HFBK student and Hamburg-based artist Annette Wehrmann, who unfortunately died already in 2010, was perfect and temporarily taken over public space without any public commission. She appeared with her interventions at specific places and set temporary markers with them. Another example would be her work Flohmarkt, Marktbüro, from 1997. 1997, sorry, on the Fleetinsel in Hamburg as part of the exhibition The Map is Not the Territory. It could also be mentioned here as an example. The square the Fleetinsel, located between Hamburg's inner city and the working class district of Neustadt, was sold by the city of Hamburg in the 1990s, and thus became the private property of a real estate fund company. This new owner placed the 4-meter-high sculpture Flora Urbana by Hamburg sculptor Johann Pfaab, 1925 to 1986, on the square. For her Flohmarkt Marktbüro project, Wehrmann enclosed Pfaab's piece in wood, the way weather-sensitive sculptures in the public space are shrouded in winter to protect them. For the duration of the exhibition, the wooden pavilion was used as the market office for a public, non-commercial flea market and as a meeting place. With this project, Annette Wehrmann succeeded in turning a commercial space where there are no longer any places for people to hang around into an at least temporary venue for the public to use. And by covering a drop sculpture, which is supposed to enhance the no longer public square culturally and decoratively, she simultaneously directs the viewer's attention to this work of art, its function in relation to the history of the privatized square. We would like to thank here the association Ort des Gegen in Hamburg, which is in charge of Annette Wehrmann's estate, for granting us permission to use the images. This conference takes place against the background of countless artistic activities and interventions that have been carried out here in Hamburg for many years. To set the scene, I will briefly describe some of them here and ask for your indulgence. If I cannot list all of them, that should be mentioned here. Nora, in turn, will try to explore the notions of counter-monuments and para-monuments with examples in between. In the late 1980s, and to the student says, sorry.
In the late 1980s, and especially in the 1990s, after decades of struggle for memory, a new, almost omnipresent, self-reflexive confrontation with Nazi crimes began to take place in public art. As James Edward Young wrote in 1992, quote, Germany's ongoing Denkmalarbeit, monument work, simultaneously displaces and constitutes the object of memory, end of quote. In this context, he coins the term counter-monument, which he primarily defines in relationship to the praxis of Jochen and Esther Scharleff-Gerz, but also with reference to the work of Horst Hoheisel, seeing therein a, quote, German memory against itself, unquote. These counter-memory projects were distinct in that they did not forestall the debate and seek to replace it through a monumental presence. Rather than taking over this work from individuals, the ground was to be opened for ongoing debate. The resultant formal artistic strategies hover between presence and absence. In this context, the best known example is the Harbour Monument against fascism, war and violence, and for peace and human rights by Jochen Gerz and Esther Scharleff-Gerz. When it was erected in 1986, the work consisted of an almost 12-meter-high pedestal, stele in German, that asked passers-by to take part in the remembrance by inscribing their names upon it. During this process, the pillar was gradually sunken into the ground. In 1987, the artist Horst Hoheisel created a monument for Documenta 8. Here too, the point was not to close memory through a simple reconstruction or a classical monument, but instead to keep it open, thereby referring to the inconclusive nature of memory. Thus, Hoheisel built a monument as a negative form. So again, we have here a negative form, a form that goes inside instead of going up. His design references a fountain with an obelisk, a nearly 12-meter-high, 12-tiered pyramidal sculpture on a sandstone catchment in front of the castle city hall. So where there is now a negative monument, there was historically an obelisk. And Nazi activists demolished this obelisk in a pogrom in April 1939 because they understood it as a Jewish fountain. It was donated by Sigmund Aschrodt, a citizen of Kassel, in 1908 to commemorate the new city hall building. Both the fountain and the building were designed by architect Karl Roth. Hoheiser's counter-monument now consists of, and I quote him, sinking the fountain's lost inverted form into the city hall square. The pyramid is thereby transformed into a funnel into which the fountain's water loudly cascades. This mirror image of the former fountain, which reaches the groundwater level, thus become the sign of a rupture, the void that had opened and was no longer to be filled. So one of our questions is, what happens with these opened wounds if they don't hurt anymore, while still racism and anti-Semitism are going on?
Another important example for artistic impulses for the discourse of remembrance would be the project Stadtfahrt, City Trip by Martha Rosler. As early in 1993, Martha Rosler made public here in Hamburg with her project Stadtfahrt critical questions about the handling of the city's Jewish heritage. Thus, as part of Stadtfahrt, she organized a collective performance at sites of Jewish culture. Martha Rosler's bus tour took the public to the sites of two former Jewish cemeteries, one of which still exists but is closed, while the other one in the Ottensen district has been destroyed by the Nazis, who built air raid shelters on the site. The second project had the title An Empty Space in Ottensen, Contaminated by History, Capital and Asbestos, and addressed the disappearance of Jewish culture. After the Second World War, a department store was built on this very site. When the department store was demolished in 1991, to make way for a huge shopping mall, gravestones and human bones were found. The Green Party tried to stop the building with the help of members of the Hasidic Jewish Burial Society. Rosler was invited to participate in a project that included bus tours by artists. She wrote a script in short paragraphs that she handed out to the participants. At the first stop, the group explored the customs of Jewish burial. At the second station in Ottensen, the site of the disappeared cemetery, the participants read their paragraphs aloud and together constructed a narrative web that addressed past and present, the economics of land use and private property, the memory of persecution of Jews by the Nazis and others, shopping malls, buried and exhumed bones, and historical and literal contamination, raising the question of whether and how land contaminated by history can be reclaimed. The next example is the Hamburg Monument Fall, 1967 to 1968. The University of Hamburg, like you might know, emerged from the Hamburger Kolonialinstitut. 53 years ago, in the night of the 1st of November 1968, students of the University of Hamburg toppled two monuments in front of the university's main building. Those toppled from their pedestals were the two colonial officers, Hermann von Wisman, 1853 to 1905, and Hans Dominik, 1870, and what is this? And 1910. Oh, we have an echo. Okay. The Wisman Monument, erected in 1909. Ich habe hier ein Echo auf der Bühne.
Der macht Echo.
Oder der Laptop. Ah, okay, danke. Jetzt geht's wieder. Dann fange ich da nochmal an. Genau. The Wisman Monument, erected in 1909 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, today a twin city of Hamburg, had been brought to Hamburg by colonial lobbyists after the First World War in order to create a central memorial for the German colonies lost in the First World War at the university in 1922. In 1935, the memorial to Hans Dominic, originally planned for Yaoundé, Cameroon, was then erected opposite the Wisman Memorial. Since the beginnings of the 1960s, these monuments were criticized. As early as 1967, students attempted to topple the Wisman Monument several times in order to criticize the honoring of German colonialism and to draw attention to the legacy of the Permanent Colonial Institute, the title of the ASTA, the Student Parliament publication at the time. However, the university kept rebuilding the monument. Then, on November 1st, 1968, the final and definitive overthrow of both the Wisman and Dominic monuments took place. The fact that this Hamburg Memorial Fall is being remembered is thanks to the research center Hamburg's Post-Colonial Heritage at the University of Hamburg, who is kind of grown out of the Colonial Institute. Komme ich jetzt noch?
Nein, du. Gut. Kassel's Königsplatz lies only a few hundred meters from the location of the former Aschrott Fountain. From summer 2017 until fall 2018, an obelisk stood there once more. Olu Oguibe's documenta work, which has been called deformed, growing accustomed to the echo of the Nazi word degenerated, could be a strategy here. And in the context of documenta, this is as ironic as it is bitter. The fact that a fountain stands before the city hall like an open wound could change neither the AfD's position nor the city's debate about the obelisk. What is more, no one even noticed the ironic and scandalous repetition of the right-wing threat to an obelisk in Kassel's city center. In formal terms, Olu Oguibe's vilified work is anything but a counter-monument as they were described before. Instead of receding into the background, the obelisk projects boldly into the space, occupying the Königsplatz. I propose that the monument for strangers and refugees by Oguibe may be understood as a para-monument, as a reappropriation of the powerful monumentality. With respect to German counter-monuments, I would call it a para-monument. It does not negate the monumental, but rather aligns itself with the form and discourse of commanding monuments in order to turn them against themselves. So it's, I mean, you see that it relates to the Bible, it relates to the history of monumentality, but by calling it a monument for strangers and refugees, it uses the form to turn it against itself. This complex relationship, which is neither against the monument nor fully defined by it, can be described with the prefix para. For the Greek prefix para means both, from, by, beside, alongside, as well as while, during, and in the figurative sense, in comparison, by contrast, against, and counter. Although the Greek marks a difference and not a contradiction, it is nevertheless the prefix that became contra in Latin. As a praxis that simultaneously operates within and beyond the sediments of monumental histories of violence, I understand Oguibe's obelisk as a massive and concrete form of reappropriation. Thus, the para-monument is not an anti-monument. Rather, it is an uncanny praxis that seeks to bring back to life the ghosts of sedimented conflicts and histories of violence.
We could list here many more examples for artistic and activist strategies from the fields of anti-fascist remembrance politics, anti-racist and decolonial memorial demands, which have done important work for many years in many places, also here in Hamburg. So there is a Hamburg history in which our conference stands, such as activities of the Cooperative Lampedusa, the Silent University here in town, the Baltic Raw Eco-Favela, the Butt Club, the Schwabingrad Ballet, Die Untüchtigen, Gintersdorfer Klassen, the activities of decolonizing Hamburg post-colonial, and the cooperative of Aufklärung Tatort Schützenstraße. And also here at the HFBK, for example, Michaela Ott, professor of philosophy, who has focused on the theme of post-colonialism in several seminars and symposia.
There is still a lot to say, but we'll end here, because this is only the beginning of a conference at which we want to work on a new perspective from the point of view of contested memories, a perspective that confronts the so-called new German historians conflict. We want to discuss and exchange historical political struggles and aesthetic strategies and work on solidarities where critical positions in public discourse are all too often played off against each other. But perhaps we first have to take time to think about and fight for these solidarities, and this conference is also looking for a space for this.
Like all conferences, this one is also a collective endeavor. We organized it within the framework of the HFBK with Julia Stolber and Beate Ansbuch. Thank you so much for the many hours of thinking together, for all your work, for your clarity and coordination power. Thank you. Thanks also. Thanks also to Bärbel Harti and Heike Bock for the organization and all the other works you did for us. To Ronja Lotz for the internet presence. Thanks to David Huss, technology, Max Likö, video recording, Ulf Freihoff, screening support here for our screening area. Tim Albrecht for doing the photos tonight and for also making it possible that we have this beautiful magazine here. As well to all employees of the caretaker's office, our Hausmeisterei, and last but not least to Kifan Su for the clever and clear design of the folder. Our thanks also go to our president, Martin Köttering, who supported the idea and the project from the very first moment and made it possible as a HFBK project.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You can find the program in the folders, but in more detail with abstracts in the Lerchenfeld magazine, the magazine of the HFBK Hamburg. You will see there that we start today with an evening that outlines the topics and that we invite you to city walks tomorrow, before the conference then deepens the topics on Friday and Saturday. Here in the Aula are installations by the students that are connected to the Para City Walks installed in 4 historic vitrines. They will be presented later today. At the back, there's a table with drinks for the coffee breaks, and there's also a viewing area with video works.
As part of this conference, we organized a screening. Various screens are on display here in the back of this auditorium. You find it here on the right-hand side from my perspective. So the first screen, you can see the movie Wir sind alle Kanaken, a film work by HFBK student Kervin and Pere from this year. The second screen, there's installed Ramadram, a self-made soap opera from 2020 by the group New Media Socialism, which includes former HFBK student Judith Rau. The third screen shows Invisible Ecstasies, a video work of HFBK student Junia Fujita from this year. On the very last screen, the fourth screen, we have a little mixed program. You can see the music video is nerved by Den Goldenen Zitronen featuring Latoya, Manly, Spain. and contributions from 2021 to the discussion about the Bismarck Monument here in Hamburg. The trailer Bismarck Dekolonial by Yolanda Guterres, and 2 trailers of the group Projektion Kolonial, Projektion Bismarck. So thank you for all artists who gave us the videos.
In this sense, yeah, and also in the sense of these struggles and videos that you can see in the break, we refer to the cultural scientist Peggy Pische, who said in an interview in the Taz from a BPOC position, I quote her, about the anti-racist remembrance work, quote, "We are all like archaeologists. We constantly have to dig up our history, and the next morning we have to start again because the sand has blown over it again," end of quote. We see this memory work with Headwind as the basis for our conference, and we are very much looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so this was the introduction. I hope it was okay. It was not too boring. Now, what we thought for tonight, because classically at conferences you will have like the keynote lectures in the evening, but as we conceptualized our conference more in a dialogical manner and as a way to understand together where we stand, we decided to conceptualize the program for today around dialogues. And we are extremely honored and happy that people that we really think are amazing accepted to be with us and to try to understand where we are. So we will start with a dialogue with Mirjam Zadoff and Ayşe Güleç, and then there will be a talk between Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock and Olu Oguibe. And after that, the students will present. So please come with us, Ayşe and Mirjam.
Alles gut? Ja, gut. That's perfect. Okay, then we just continue. I'm very proud that you came to Hamburg. It's really nice. And let me now introduce to you Mirjam Zadoff, who come from Munich today to Hamburg. So Mirjam Zadoff is director of the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism, having previously held the Alwin Rosenfeld Chair to Jewish Studies and the position of Associate Professor to History of Indiana University, Bloomington. She's a member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and was visiting faculty at ETH Zurich, University of California, Berkeley, Humboldt University Berlin, and Augsburg University. Her publications include Werner Scholem, A German Life, next year in Marienbad, The Lost Worlds of Jewish Spa Culture, and just recently edited together with Nikolaus Schafhausen, Tell Me About Yesterday, Tomorrow.
And okay, I present immediately Ayşe. Ayşe Güleç is so many things besides a very important colleague and person I am happy to think with sometimes. Maybe I start with the newest news. You are inaugural visiting professor for artistic research at the Städelschule in Frankfurt. I'm happy for all your students. Beside that, you work for Documenta 15 now. For Documenta 15, you are part of the artistic team. So you work together with Ruan Gruppa and other colleagues in this artistic team on the Documenta that we will all see in spring arising. Before that, in Documenta 14.
It will happen, yeah.
Yeah, it will.
Yes, for sure.
5 years ago in Documenta 14, you worked together with Adam Cimcik very closely on realizing very important artworks for Documenta 14. And you have been very involved in important activist work in relation to the fight against the NSU complex in Germany. You have curated exhibitions, theater plays, or let's say debates that use the format of the theater to bring the topic in the German discourse. And I think that as you really used all means that were possible for you, artistic means, political means, and also means of social work, a lot happened in the last years. And I think you are a very strong and important person in relation to that, and I'm happy that you came here to think with us about what history, politics, and memory work can mean today.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So we thought of starting with asking you if you could please start by giving us your assessment of the current state of remembrance work and historical politics. And maybe, Mirjam, you would like to answer first.
Okay.
It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I try to be very brief. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to see all these real people and be at a real event after everything else has been cancelled. It's of course very difficult to make this kind of assessment. Nora, you've mentioned this development that, that brought us to this very specific moment when Germany is talking proudly about something that is called memory culture. It took a very long time, like referring to the memory of the Holocaust, of course, until this would happen, because it was mainly survivors and groups of former concentration camp inmates who carried that burden, and nobody else was particularly interested. That changed in the 1980s, and of course, especially with German reunification. We don't need to explain why that happened, but of course it did. And I would say until the 80s or 90s, this talking about memory of the Holocaust in Germany was still something which was always connected to political resistance. And it was always connected to outsider positions. It was not institutionalized. It was kind of like, when I started studying some time ago in the early 90s, this was the place to be. This was where, the important things happened. This is where the great sort of like intellectuals were starting their discussions. This is, you would come to a seminar and something would happen with a group of people, and they would, leave the room and be completely, transferred in their experience the change in. It was an extremely lively intellectual exchange with, of course, many throwbacks and many disappointments, and lots of things were not possible, and there were many continuities, personal continuities at the universities in every part of society, and then, of course, this changed, and institutions appeared in city centers that were dealing with memory and memory culture, and the whole idea entered the general discourse. And this was influenced by the original idea. The first Holocaust museum was not built in Germany, but in the United States as an initiative of survivors. And it was always American influence that brought about change here. This kind of transnational discourse, which was extremely important at that time. And you've mentioned Black Lives Matters, and of course we see that kind of transnational influence again today, and it goes both ways. Just to give you an example, an institution you all, I'm sure, know about, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, which has been erected in 2018 by Brian Stevenson as head of the Equal Justice Initiative in the United States, which is an organization which helps POCs who are brought into prison and tries to get them out. And Stevenson built this memorial, which is it's not a national memorial. It wasn't built by federal money. It was erected with private money, and he built it after he came to Berlin and saw the Holocaust Memorial, and went to I'm sorry.
Die Batterien alle wahrscheinlich. Nicht drücken, das Licht muss an sein.
Okay. Okay. And so he saw the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and he went to South Africa and was inspired by these kind of other transnational examples. The situation today, I would say, I don't have to explain anything about German memory culture to you. You all know that. But I think it's a phenomenon that we can see Holocaust museums today all over the world. Also, and often, I wouldn't say especially, but also in countries which have not dealt with their own histories and their own guilty parts in history. Which is a phenomenon. It's a result of a discussion that happened around 2000. I think that's kind of a sign that I'll stop talking now.
Ghosts.
There are some ghosts. And it's an interesting development to see what will happen. What happens now, sort of in terms of transnational memory. And then, of course, one of the challenges for any institution that is involved in memory work in Germany is, of course, that Germany, after a very, very long time, has realized during the last 20 years that it's an immigrant country. And that there are many memories, and the question is how we include these memories. And this is a discussion that is ongoing, and I think it will be interesting to get into that in our conversation. But I want to pass on the floor to Ayşe.
Thank you very much. Where should I start? The topic is really so huge and important, so I'm really honored to be here, to be invited. I would like to answer this question from my own perspective, and this perspective is an anti-racist, anti-fascist perspective, in which I'm myself is active since many years, and so I'm also an activist researcher, and of course I'm researching also all these topics. And therefore I love to answer this question using specific okay. I love to answer this questions using specific examples from the NSU case. Actually, in this year, started many in November this year. Many activities started in general in Germany in November. It was I would say it was a multiple anniversary year, because it was 20 years after the first killing, and where Šimček was killed 20 years ago. 15 years ago, it was Halit Yozgat in his internet cafe was killed, and also Mehmet Kubaschik also 15 years ago in Dortmund. Until 2006, so the NSU until 2006 was killing 9 post-migrants in whole Germany, in the west part of Germany, apart from Rostock. And they killed also independent shop owners. And 1 year after Halit Yozgat, who was killed in Kassel, there was also the killing of the police officer, Michel Kiesewetter. In this year, in November, to have this multiple anniversary, all the theaters came together and they made a big network. I would say also it was a counter network against the NSU, and they opened all their stages and bring attention. The aim was to bring the attention to the victims and to their relatives, and not always to the NSU members. These 18 theaters opened their stage. They brought some pieces, old or new theater pieces, but also they opened also their space for panel discussions, different events, screenings, and so on. And additionally, there was also moving concert. I would say moving concert because that was also performative, but also people could also join and make sound, so that the sound from the city was taken to the next city. And all these activities started to connect all the cities with these programs. And the program was called Kein Schlussstrich, what means like no closing or something like that. And for me, thinking about the topic of our evening today, I would say to remember it's not something which is passive. So you need to be active because to remember is an active practice. We need something which is activating also to remember. And this active practice of remembrance I would like to highlight. But in the same time, when we think about active remembrance, there's also an imperative inside, right? I mean, this imperative lies between the poles between remembering, wanting to remember, but also between not remember, saying no remember, but also between forgetting, wanting to forget, and also wanting not to know, not to remember. And not wanting to know, not wanting to remember, leads us to a structural ignorance. From post-colonial or post-fascist Germany, so I would say the ghosts of the past are still present, and we also have to ask ourselves the question, who has the privilege the privilege and the right not to remember, and who has to remember? I mean, these are from the perspective of the NSU, knowing the NSU and the NSU complex, with all these apparatus of the state, I would say this question is very important to understand our present, but also the past and the future.
Maybe this is the right moment to address now the role of the art in the whole complex. And Mirjam, you have done 2 years ago this exhibition, Don't Tell Me About, don't tell me.
Do tell me.
Do tell me. Do tell me. Tell me about yesterday. Yesterday is just wiped out. Tomorrow. And so some of the artists we invited were also in the show, and I was lucky to be also there in the show you curated together with Nicola Schafhausen. And there you took for the whole publication, and everything was around the show. You had this beautiful citation of James Baldwin, and we wrote it up here. The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. And maybe you can let us a little bit introduce us in the background of the exhibition and all your ideas, because your house now in Munich incorporates a lot of contemporary art in the permanent exhibition.
Yeah, where did this project start? So, to give you a brief background, the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism was a latecomer among these institutions because, because of Munich, so it took a little longer. It's a center for, it's called a Center for Education and Learning, not a museum, which was erected on a space which hadn't been used before for a couple of decades, although it's prime real estate located at the Königsplatz, but this was where the infamous Brown House, the Nazi headquarters, was located and destroyed after the war. And so this Center for Education and Learning should offer a way into the very specific past of Munich as the center of the Nazi movement, and it was opened in 2015 with a permanent exhibition designed by a group of German historians, which is talking about the specific role of Munich and does not use any original, it's all sort of, the whole exhibition is in facsimile. There are no original documents or objects because there was, the historians were afraid that this would give a certain aura to the space. It's very, it's very, like the viewpoint is kind of like to pass on as much information as possible, and the audience was seen sort of like the Munich population, but especially also school groups. Then the center opened its doors in 2015, and a crisis unfolded. It actually started I remember that in a way it started to unfold in Munich in November 2014 with groups of refugees who were refusing to come down from numbers of trees at the in the center of Munich, and then a crisis unfolded, or not a crisis unfolded, but a situation unfolded which was declared a crisis. But I think what was the crisis, the real crisis, is that suddenly this country became aware that it had a massive problem with far-right politicians, which have entered the mainstream. That in a way that there is more we're dealing with than the past. And this was the moment, sort of the point of departure where we started talking or thinking about this exhibition together with Nikolaus Schaffhausen and Juliane Bischoff. I invited them to think about, a different kind of viewpoint, how we should think about the past and how we should see a center like this, because the general idea was, of course, to pass on as much knowledge as possible, and you start sort of with a group of knowledgeable people who are doing guided tours, who are representing this knowledge to others who don't know, and they might not know because they're young, because they're school kids. They might not know because they're post-migrants. They might not know for other reasons. But the question, and this was sort of like the starting point, was what is hidden sort of behind all these answers, and what is the problem with only these kind of answers? Because on the one hand, you could say, like right now, when we're dealing with so many, discussions on fake news and so on, that knowledge and information is crucial, but knowledge and information is not everything. And a lot of people are not being reached by knowledge and information, as we learn now, especially with the pandemic, that, even the fact that somebody dear to you might die after having not been vaccinated is not enough knowledge in some cases. So knowledge can be helpful, but knowledge is not a cure for everything. And so one of the things we started to do, which was especially important for me, was to open the doors of this center and sort of like metaphorically open the doors to memory culture, because I think what is crucial is the question is who is talking and who is the expert and who is listening. And I think what we should do, or what we are doing right now, and sort of like I don't want to preach to the rest of us, but sort of our way is to think about who are the experts and who can be included as experts and who can be invited as experts. And experts can be 15-year-old kids, experts can be artists, experts can be people who look at us from outside. For example, I don't know, colleagues in the United States who work on the history of racism in America, when they look at Germany and sort of our state of affairs here in terms of memory politics, it's extremely important, extremely interesting to discuss what is going on here, what is going on there, how we influence each other. But also to think about, you know, different kinds of voices in as part of our society. And as I said, like we started with kids, we invited school kids to do an exhibition at our center, which was extremely interesting because they were, you know, many of them were not kids anymore. They were learning to be car painters and do all sorts of other things, and brought in completely different voices and ideas. And because they are especially a group who do not expect to be heard in society. They do not expect to have a voice in this society, because if you become a car painter, usually you don't spend much time on a stage when people listen to you. So it was an idea of sort of like creating different kinds of groups, and with this specific exhibition, it was about inviting artists, and not only artists who work in Germany and who know the German context, but also artists who work on memory culture in different contexts, who work on trauma, who work on specific experiences of memory in Canada, in African countries, in, you know, various contexts. And it started a little bit like as an experiment, because we did not have a project, a reference project. We could say, oh yeah, we use this as a reference, because we didn't have an empty space to fill. It was not a white cube, it was not a neutral space. It was a highly politicized space, a space with all this information about the history of National Socialism in Munich. It's not a Holocaust museum, it's really a museum sort of which is dealing with the dictatorship as such. And it was extremely interesting to see how the artists transformed this whole context and this whole narrative by contributing their, on one hand, sometimes very emotional, sometimes very personal narratives, but also sometimes very political, sometimes very critical. And in a way, it was like breaking up this discourse from going away from this, yes, there is somebody who's in a speaker position and someone else is in a position as a listener. The artists really acted as, or they didn't act as, but we felt sort of the product in the end was they were intermediaries. They were kind of like facilitating a dialogue which was not there before. And suddenly a situation, sort of an institution which had a very specific purpose and aim, became temporarily a space for a very vivid exchange. And this was extremely interesting for us to see with, you know, your contribution, Michaela, and Leon's and Heba's and many others. We suddenly had these many voices which were part of this larger discourse. And of course the institution was the frame. It was kind of like German memory culture suddenly opened doors, so to put it a little bit dramatic. As I said, this was just our experience and our example. I don't say that this is, we found a solution for anyone else. I think that we're all working in sort of in a trial and error and in a learning experience. And I think this is one of the things that is really crucial about memory, that its nature is inconclusive, and it says a lot about our present, but it does say a lot about our future also. That's why we called it Talk About Yesterday, Tell Me About Yesterday, Tomorrow. And it included this, as you've just mentioned, the imperative. It's like, tell me about it. It's like, talk to me, be involved. That was really interesting and important for us to ask people to be part of that, to invite people to be part of it. Because I see, as representing an institution of German memory culture, I do see it as a privilege that we can do this work. And I also see this obligation that comes with it, and the obligation is to open the doors to what is German society today and whoever represents German society today.
Absolutely. I would like to add, and I'm really speaking now from a really a practice, which is not only an exhibition or something. So I would like to speak about the different memorials for the NSU victims. We spoke a lot about para-monuments and so on. And this discussion is really important also for these different cities and Hamburg has also NSU victim here in Hamburg. And what I find really very important is to understand that we have different parts of memorial, right? We have the state, which want all the city politicians, who have an idea how to remember Halit or Osman Taşköprü or Enver Şimşek and so on. But there's also the wish of the families. And instead of listening them, they are silenced. And this is a big and very important difference. And if we would listen to the families of the victims, for example in Kassel, the wish of the family of Halit Yozgat, the father, was asking and reminding that the Holländische Straße, which is an old street, a tradition in Kassel, because it's connecting Kassel with Netherlands, Holland, formerly, and he wanted, after it was public that Halit was killed by the NSU, he was saying, please change the name of Holländische Straße in Halitstraße. Not Halit Yozgat, but this is really important, in Holländische Straße in Halitstraße. It's a metaphor for all the victims of NSU. And the city was not doing that because they think this name of Holländische Straße is very important for the history of the city, because it's connecting the history of Kassel and with Holland, with Netherlands. So that was not possible. But if we imagine what happens when the street is named in Halitstraße, and the street is really big, a lot of houses are there, it's a very active neighborhood. So then everyone should live with the death of Halit, and not only the family. And so I see this also as a para-monument. When we imagine that the street name is changed, so I see this is also a kind of para-monument. What do you think, Nora? Because exactly. You are field expert for para-monuments.
We think about it together. Actually, we should ask maybe Olu, who will join us in some minutes. But for me, this is exactly what I am looking for coming together around those strategies, contemporary strategies that actually manifest the need to remember, because memory is a need and a right. And it's weird that some people have it and others not.
And additionally, I think we have to speak also about externalizing, because this is also a big topic in the field of racism and fascism, of course, or in the field of anti-racism and because it's very difficult to make a memorial for the victims of racism in Germany. Still very, very unusual, very different, and very difficult also. And I think this is related to the typical like Stele format. This is always happening for the victims. This is the only idea what cities have. And this is a kind of closing the history, saying we know it happens, but now we are closing the story.
Yeah.
And this is a kind of externalizing also the problem. So taking the racism out the body, putting it in the stone and putting the stone on somewhere in the front of the street or somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. Totally. Yeah. And that is being done, although it would be so easy to rename a street, wouldn't it?
So let's keep it as a call for a practice and as a call to reflect the form also, the form and format of petrifying memory instead of bringing it into life, practicing it. And from here, I think it's a good moment to go further because, of course, we planned too much for our time. We have a lot to say, but it's the beginning of a conference. So we also planned tonight that we would share other concepts here, and then tomorrow and the day after tomorrow we will discuss a lot. So now this would be my moment to hand over to Lynhan. And I think that people need some kind of break, even if we didn't plan it. So let's make a short break against our plan. And let's meet here again in 5 minutes for Lynhan and Olu. Thank you so much, Ayşe and Mirjam.
Immer weiter. Ja, das wollte ich eigentlich.
Another very important moment of this inaugural evening of our conference, a conversation between...
Are we all set?
A conversation between Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock and Olu Oguibe. I will present Lynhan and she will take over from here. So, hey Lynhan, it's wonderful that you came and it's really beautiful that you agreed to speak with Olu. Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock is a curator and researcher at Savi Contemporary, where she's part of the participatory archive project Colonial Neighbors. She received her MA in Post-Colonial Cultures and Global Policy at Goldsmiths University of London. In her work within the permanent collection of Savi Contemporary, she looks for colonial traces that are manifested in our present. And I can tell you, and she will tell us about it in these coming days, that the ongoing struggle around monuments in Berlin is very much part of her practice. Archive project, Colonial. The collaborative archive that she's responsible for in Savi dedicates itself to discussing silenced histories and to the decanonization of the Western gaze through objects and the stories behind them. With close collaboration from artists, initiatives, and activists, the archive is activated through hybrid forms of practice. You worked also for Documenta 14, which might be a good connection also to the collaboration with Olu. And I think I hand over to you so that I don't steal your time for your conversation.
You are now
Thank
unmuted.
you very much.
You are now muted.
For being here with us.
You are now unmuted.
Thank you very much, Nora, for this kind intro and also for the invitation. It's my great honor and pleasure to bring Olu Oguibe now. Thanks also for inviting him. I shortly read his bio as well. Olu Oguibe is an award-winning multimedia artist and writer whose work often straddles minimalist formalism and engagement with global social issues. His work has been exhibited in museums and galleries around the world, and he has participated in several international biennials and triennials, including the Venice, Havana, and Busan biennials. He has also created permanent public works in many countries and curated or co-curated several significant international exhibitions. His writings on art, literature, and cultural theory are widely published. His many honors include the State of Connecticut Governor's Arts Award for Excellence and Lifetime Achievement in 2013, and a 2017 Arnold Bode Prize of the City of Kassel for his work in Documenta 14. In 2017, he left his position as professor of painting at the University of Connecticut to concentrate on making only art. Welcome, Olu Oguibe. I want to start, as Nora has already mentioned today in her presentation in the beginning, the obelisk, the monument that was in Kassel. And I wanted to also think about para monuments and its presence, but focus more on the absence of para monuments. So that obelisk that was written in Turkish, Arabic, German, and English, with a German inscript, with the title Das Fremdlinge und Flüchtlinge Monument, Monument for Strangers and Refugees, was, as Nora already said, removed after the 100 days of Documenta and 2 weeks afterwards. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but an AfD city councillor mentioned in a meeting that the obelisk was ideologically polarizing and distorted art. In German, it was written entstellte Kunst, which has this uncanny feel of the word entstellte, entartete Kunst that the Nazis used. And I want to think about the absence of the monument and another work by Olu Oguibe that was called New Monument Series. And I'm showing you here a slide from an exhibition in Vienna that Bonaventure saw being deconcurated. And this work is called is from the New Monument series in 2020. Here dedicated to Scott D. Warren, Mimo Lucano, and Olu Oguibe mentioned also that Carola Rackete, so up to 20 people are honored in this work. And I was thinking about this beautifully perpetuating spirit of the obelisk. So the absence of the obelisk is not about the absence of the object itself, but in my understanding, it's more about the act of taking someone in as the act of the protest that is still very vividly in this other work. Maybe I'll let you also speak.
You are now muted.
We don't hear.
You are now unmuted.
Sorry, we cannot hear. Olu, sorry, one moment.
You are now muted. You are now unmuted.
You're still muted, can it be?
You are now muted.
I'm actually unmuted, but I can still hear what you said 5 minutes ago. So, okay, now you can hear me, right? Okay. No, I was just saying that I apologize for not being there physically. Actually, I'm unmuted, but I get.
You are now unmuted.
We can hear you perfectly. I just have to always mute myself when you speak, so there's no reverb here in the room, no echo. We can hear you.
Yeah, that's not the problem though, because what I said 2 minutes ago, I'm hearing myself now. So that's not going to work.
Okay. Tech help.
How can that be?
That's
okay. I'm trying to look. Actually, the only could it be that you have the stream open as well, like the YouTube stream on your computer, maybe?
for some reason it keeps recording.
Yeah, that's okay. That's for us because we need to edit it later as well. But do you have a YouTube stream of this conference open as well in a different tab or something?
Probably. Yeah.
That might be the reason why you hear yourself delayed as well, because yeah.
I've turned that off now.
Yeah. So now it should work, I guess. I will resume the
Okay.
recording because we need it for editing later.
All right. Excellent.
Okay.
Okay, maybe should
All
I?
right.
Hi, thanks for being
Hi.
patient. Sorry we're running late.
Yes. The thing, of course, is that because of the technical issues, I actually can't remember where we stopped. We're probably gonna have to start all over again.
Okay, I give you keywords. I said absence, and that the absence of the obelisk is still very present, not only in the on the Königsplatz in Kassel, but also in your artistic practice. So I was going back to this work, of the New Monument series, which here is an installation shot that was shown in the Galerie Kandelhofer in Vienna. And I wanted to speak about the spirit that is free of the form of this obelisk. But the inscription, I was a stranger and you took me in, from the Fremdlinge and Flüchtlinge Monument that is present in this new work, the New Monument series, that is basically dedicated to people like Mimo Lucano, the politician from Riace, Scott D. Warren, or Carola Rackete, who also risked her own life and was charged in Germany for bringing people trying to save people. So I just try to bring the connection and the absence of the obelisk that is still very present.
Right. So,
You are
what
now
was the
muted.
question then? Would you like me to speak to the connection or to the new work?
You are now unmuted.
Maybe how, the absence of the obelisk, how it impacted you, or the way you still feel the obelisk presence, and also the new work, the new monument series, yes.
Well, thank you.
You are now muted.
Well, the thing is that obviously the obelisk is still present, in a sense, because the obelisk is still physically present in Kassel. It's in a different location, obviously, but it's still present, and it's still part of the cultural landscape in Kassel. It's still playing an important role in activist work within the community in Kassel. So the obelisk is still very much physical.
Sorry.
Yes. You are now muted.
Site of the new site of the obelisk, of people who have been, in a sense, blacklisted by the far right in Germany, and people who've had to discover from public records that their names have been blacklisted, and members of the far right are either targeting them physically or otherwise. So I'm very pleased that the space is being activated all the time in this new site. But to your very important connection there that you made, the text is the spirit of the work. The form was only a vehicle to convey that spirit, and it turned out to be a form that was very effective. But the work itself is much more than the obelisk. It's in the text, and the history, which I've shared quite a few times of that piece, is that it wasn't intended to be an obelisk. It was intended to be freestanding text, just text. Just a sculpture made of this text. Through a whole series of incidents and trials and errors, we finally decided to put that text on the obelisk. So before the form at the Königsplatz, the text existed, the idea existed, the work existed, and after the obelisk was removed from the Königsplatz and sent to a new site, the spirit of the work and the text still existed. And I decided to continue to extend that not just the work, but that spirit of the work in other forms. And this new series, I think, in a sense, addressed a certain aspect of the obelisk, which was that it is a stationary sculpture. It's a very arcane sculpture, quite frankly. It's a very old style. It's much older than any other monuments that we can think of, like the obelisk as a form coming from ancient Egypt. So when we get to the point where we're asking questions about monumentality and monuments and monoliths and sculptural forms and public spaces and how to challenge those, Nothing can be more representative of a very old idea of the public monument than the obelisk. In a sense, that's intentional, and I've discussed this in other platforms and forums as to how it still made sense to use that form and how we arrived at using it. But taking it beyond that, going back to the spirit of speaking to refugees, refuge, and to charity, and to gratitude, I decided that we could make a different kind of monument, which is not stationary and which is not quote unquote monumental, and which is not standing as a monolith in a singular space in a particular site. That's how this series came about. I wanted to take that spirit and actually return to gratitude, into using a different understanding of monuments to acknowledge individuals and organizations that are usually not monumentalized publicly, but who are actively working in the spirit of that forum, in the spirit of that work to facilitate or help or extend themselves to people who are seeking refuge, to, if you like, invent a new form of monument, which is devoted not to war heroes or to the war dead, but to private and sometimes public institutions, but mostly private individuals who are making a difference in society in relation to this particular topic. So we can, if you look at the manner in which monumentality has been challenged since the Black Lives Matter protests last year, and the Black Lives Matter protests, in fact, that's not the beginning of that particular movement of challenging monuments. It actually goes back quite a few years, and I've discussed that elsewhere. But if you look at the way that monuments have been challenged recently, it's mostly been about either removing them or replacing them with monuments that are not different from what was there before. Just addressing another side, if you like, of the train tracks. And I think that we could go further than simply taking down monuments or replacing monuments with monuments that look almost the same, even if they're not speaking the same language. And simply sending these works to these individuals to say, we acknowledge what you're doing, and this is important. It's a whole new dispersed kind of monument, monumentizing. It's not ephemeral, but it's dispersed. It's variegated. It's modest. It's something that travels in the mail. Which I just pop it in the mail. It goes to Mimo, or it goes to Scott Warren, or it goes to all the other individuals and institutions that I've been making this work for. And actually, I'm sending it to them. I'm not just making them to be in the gallery. We're sending these works to them to hang in their wall or in their bathroom or wherever they want to hang it. But to say that art in reinventing the monument is including you and your activities and your contributions and your generosity as part of that discussion, and not just replacing bronze monuments with bronze monuments. That doesn't really make a lot of sense.
You are now unmuted.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I wanted to bring back, because you said some things like new forms and also the Black Lives Matter protests. And I was thinking of actually old forms and thinking about the body in itself. So just as also the absence of objects also can become monuments. So also the mere existence of certain bodies are already or could be seen as para-monuments. And I want to refer to this article by Carolyn Randall Williams that she wrote in the New York Times, I think, when she said, "You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument." and she wrote, "I have rape-colored skin." And basically, I also want to touch upon, because you brought it in regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, the memory or the culture of remembrance. And I remember the first time I met you, actually, Olu Oguibe, was when you came to Savi Contemporary, and you had a performance and also presentation on the Chibok girls, to remember them. And I don't know if you here in the room remember, in 2014, 216 girls were abducted in the northeastern town of Chibok. And you came and then you shared something, I think, a year after their disappearance. And yeah, to this date, also less than 30 of the children only have been freed, and the rest remain in captivity, and some have since died, and almost all have been subjected to torture and rape, and many have become child mothers. And so this is now, I think, 7 years after. And just as thinking about your other works, that there's not only a price that comes with acting upon in this protest culture, but there's also a price that memory or the culture of remembrance comes with. And yeah, maybe I want to invite you to maybe briefly speak about also your contribution with the Chibok, or you don't also have to, but there's one of your works that I wanted to discuss here, is also the Biafra time capsule, which comprises of bodies, of books, letters, magazines, and transcriptions of speeches written during and after the war, the Biafra War of 1967 to 1970.
You are now muted.
Right. Well, what's the question though, Lynhan?
You are now unmuted.
You're right, I'm very bad in posing questions. I wanted to talk about the price that the culture of memory comes with. So a lot of times it's a theme, but it's not only a theme that we need to act upon, it also has its toll, its gravity. And especially we were talking yesterday together with Beate and Olu, how the work, the Biafra time capsule, is very heavy. It's, I think, 110 kilograms. And we know because we move it from one place to the other, and it's currently in Berlin. And I wanted to talk about also your culture of memory, and why, in my perception, it's so important also in your work.
Yes, perhaps at this point we might actually pull that up. If we could we could probably pull up the image of the Biafra work itself. You know, it's very interesting that you brought the work up, because the manner in which the public has experienced that particular piece is installed. It's in the ground. It's in the round in the exhibition space. First in Athens, and then last year in Austria, in Vienna. So only a few people like yourself and you know, in my studio have experienced the work. It's okay. So this is the form in which the public has experienced the work. But if we could pull up the box itself, yes, okay. So this is what you're speaking of, and it weighs a real ton, and it was a very uncanny and important that you made the connection between the physical weight of the box itself and the weight of the issue, the weight of memory, the burden, in fact, is the way that I usually like to put it, the burden of memory that's connected with this particular issue of Biafra and remembering Biafra. One of the things that we actually did with Documenta in Athens was that after the museum space showed the work, we also had an event which was called Biafra's Children, which memorialized not just the work in the museum space, but also through the bodies, if you like, of Biafra's children, because I invited, through Documenta, I invited, I think about 9 or 10 child survivors from Biafra who came to Athens physically, and we had a public event there. In fact, the late Okwuenweze was one of those Biafra's children, in fact, who was in Athens and in the audience for that particular event. It's a burden that survives. But in terms of what we remember, I think it's actually, the Biafra issue is very much typical, which is why, you know, I usually exhibit it, but I don't talk a lot about it because I prefer for people to experience it in line with all the other things that we try to remember. What's different here is that unlike other similar events, unlike the Shoah, unlike the Armenian genocide, for instance, not a lot has been written about the genocide in Biafra as genocide. There was a lot of coverage of the war itself and the suffering and the children and starvation and famine, but not a lot has been written about it as genocide, and not a lot has been done to deal with the memory, to deal with the trauma of that experience. And that's the other thing, you know, is that someone like myself and the other people who were at that event in Athens, we went through the war as children, and then after the war, we simply went back to life without, you know, without any interventions, without any contextualizations. We simply grew up out of the war into, you can't call it normal life, into after the war, and that has remained with us. So, in terms of the discussion of memories, I was a little not quite sure how to put it, but I found it a little jarring when I read that article about the body as a monument. That there's some truth to it, but it's problematic, especially in the way that it was used in that particular article, that this individual's body is a monument, is a Confederate monument, a monument to Confederate crimes. I would hesitate to describe my body as a monument of the Biafra War, because there's a whole lot more to my body than that experience. There's a whole lot more to my body than the crisis. There's a whole lot more to my, to my body than that particular history, because a monument is about a singular particular history. It may not be a single moment, but it's a singular history. And there's a whole lot more to the body than to single or singular histories. So I found that very problematic, because then you're yielding the entirety of your existence to a traumatic experience. And I think we transcend that. No matter, even when the trauma of an experience is such that people take their own lives, there's still a whole lot more to them and to their lives than the experience that led to them taking their lives. So I hesitated to accept that my body can be an embodiment of just one historical experience. I don't accept that.
You are now unmuted.
Very well. Very good. You're very right. We're more than just traumatizing experiences and holding being a vessel of trauma. I very much agree. And I want to come back and maybe in a bit also invite the audience. Maybe there are also questions from the audience. And I think there are many things that you touched upon, memory and trauma, like how can memorials actually commemorate trauma? And maybe more people want to ask you. Let me try to open up to questions, if you're okay with it. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. There are no questions yet in the chat, but maybe in the audience. And I will read them to you here. Maybe also while people are maybe thinking of a question. Days? No.
Okay.
There's one question.
Thank you very much. It was really, he can hear me, right? Or can, yeah? Yes? No? Can you hear me?
He cannot hear you.
No.
I will write it down.
Yes, just if he could develop a little bit between, about the difference between a monument and monumentality.
The question was if you could maybe talk about, for you, the difference about a monument and monumentality.
It's a complicated
You are
issue,
now muted.
isn't it? Because there's a traditional understanding of monumentality, which is that it's big. But monuments are not necessarily about monumentality, or at least the traditional or received, if you like, general understanding of monumentality. I've always understood monumentality in the sense of, to use your word, Lynhan, in terms of the weight of what is monumentalized in the monument. So actually, there's also a certain, if you like, historical connection for me there, because while we think of monuments and we think of bronze statues in public spaces, we also, in my culture, had monuments that were quite modest. We had smaller monoliths. Our monoliths in southeastern, southeastern Nigeria, our monoliths were not monumental, if you like. They were much more modest, 3 feet tall and so on, but you could have a field of them. So that's a different understanding of monumentality that I think then took effect in the West, in a work, for instance, like if you think of the Berlin monument to the Holocaust, it's not monumental in terms of going up and being huge, but it's a field of memories and a field of recollections, and it's much more modest in terms of scale. So for me, monumentality has always been not about being big. It's always been about the weight, the burden of memory that goes into the form that becomes the monument. And that's why, we have these works on paper, which people are going to put on their walls, and I'm describing them as monuments because it's about what's in the monument rather than the size or scale of the monument. So I think there's also a question of language, because in German, for instance, monuments, although we now use the English monuments in German as well, but Denkmal is not about scale. It's not about monumentality. It's about memory. It's actually more about what we remember rather than something that's monumental. So I think English sort of confuses the idea of the monument by emphasizing scale in monumentality. But in other languages, that connection is not there. It's not there in, if you like to say maybe original German, because Denkmal is the original German. But now just like in French, there are Englishisms or Anglicisms in German as well, which is why a monument comes in. So I think of monuments in terms of what is embodied in the monument rather than the scale.
You are now unmuted.
Thank you. And I also wanted to add, before there's another question, I wanted to add a quote by you that we also used in one of the projects. And I quote, "We weep at the sound of the anthem and worship the flag. We descend to the habit of kissing the earth. There's no love more blind than the love of country." And I just picked this as well as maybe an example how not only trauma or the traumatized can be memorized, but also what traumatized in the first place, so that people don't forget also how toxic nationalism is to a degree that you touched upon the word genocide. So I think in the very beginning also Nora has mentioned a dark era here in Germany, and you also mentioned the Armenian genocide. So there's also a lot to say about how not only the victim needs always to be put up front and to have to serve as a monument, but also the perpetrator we should put to the front and not forget, I guess. Maybe there's, if there are no other questions, maybe Olu, would you like to add something else?
Yeah, I mean, in response to what you
You are now muted.
Pointed out about that particular quote, and it comes from an essay that deals with several different things around different understandings of nationalism. There was a time, for instance, when nationalism in the colonized world was very important. People had to reclaim their nationalism, and these were, in fact, in many cases, new inventions of nationalism. But then you also have the nationalism which is about protectionism, which is about fear and anxiety, which is about keeping out the outsider. And at the point you get to an extent of that protectionism where violence becomes part of the strategy, and anxiety and fear take over. And that becomes dangerous, because then people are not quite sure what it is they're actually protecting. It becomes a cult, it becomes a religion, and nationalism at that point becomes very dangerous. And of course, historically, we've seen the results of that. I was, in fact, in that essay looking at my own personal relationship with nationalism, which eventually led to my renouncing my Nigerian citizenship in 2013, and returning my passport to the Nigerian government, because I could no longer relate to a nation that was willing to destroy or kill or starve to death more than 1 million children of my generation without addressing that history 20, 40, 50 years afterwards. So that was the context. But in terms of, I guess, in terms of memorializing, it sort of takes us back to how certain things are remembered and others are sort of forgotten. Others are, and that has happened with the Armenian genocide, in fact, because although it's been written about a lot, Turkey still refuses to accept that there was
You are now unmuted.
genocide against the Armenians.
Thank you. I think there's one last question here from the audience.
Yes, thank you. I would be interested in the form of the obelisk, the shape of the obelisk, and its relation to power and to hegemonic historical narratives. I want to make a short connection to actually the story that Nora mentioned about a monument in Vienna that was erected by without permission by concentration camp survivors. in 1951, and they have demanded a monument already before that illegal erection, and the one that they demanded also had the shape of an obelisk, and they wanted actually to have a stone containing ashes of concentration camp victims to be like the foundational stone of that obelisk. What they tried to do, I believe, was to include their narrative in the hegemonic narrative, like to kind of undermine, if you want, that hegemonic narrative. And I would be interested in your choice of that shape of the obelisk and how you see the relation of the shape of the obelisk to hegemonic historical narratives. And if you see this connection, how did you use that for your project?
Could you hear the question?
Yes, thank you so much. I don't know if Lynhan could help me recall the question, the full question, because I couldn't hear it completely.
And power, and the person asked, did bring in a monument in Vienna into relation that was erected in 1951 illegally by concentration camp survivors. And they too did choose the form as an obelisk, and the foundation of this monument was ashes by concentration camp, not survivors, victims. And yeah, and he wanted to ask about the choice, your choice of the shape, and how you see the relation of the shape to a hegemonic, forms. Okay.
Yes, thank you. That question has come up quite a number of times. Ever since, in fact, we made the work, not just the nature of the form of the obelisk, but its ubiquity as well. It's a form that is beloved around the world, especially the Western world, ever since it was discovered in Egypt. And in terms, in some ways, obviously, it represents conquest, because the obelisks were seized from Egypt and dispersed in Europe. But also they began to be copied. And in fact, they began to be made in graveyards all around the world. So they weren't just about Napoleon, pulling an obelisk and putting it in Paris, or the Italians doing the same. But they were democratized, if you like, and made to represent a different kind of memory. So if you had a loved one that passed away, you could put up an obelisk on their graveyard, on their grave as a gravestone to remember them. So it's in a sense a very very conservative form. But there's also the connection that people make historically with hegemony, and people also make a certain connection. And I always like to point out that the monarch in Egypt who built the greatest number of obelisks and the biggest ones, in fact, was a woman. And it was about worship of the sun. It, at that time, had nothing to do with hegemony per se, but it did come to represent that. So it's a very complicated form. But if you look at a different side of history, we thought about the connection with Egypt and with the quote on the obelisk, which is a quote from Jesus in the Christian scriptures, speaking of himself as a refugee, and the fact that we are told that in real life, Jesus was a refugee child in Egypt. So there's a very important religious and historical, well, probably more religious than historical, connection between Egypt, refuge, and Christianity, and charity, openness to strangers and travelers and people seeking refuge, and the choice of the obelisk, besides the fact that people wanted to have an obelisk in the center of their town, so that made it very popular as well.
You are now unmuted.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. Person was nodding. I will just turn this and say thank you for being here. I don't know if you can see.
Thank you.
Okay.
I apologize again for not being able to be there physically, but I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope that I wish we had more time to exchange with people in the audience, especially. But thank you so much, and thank you to Nora and to Michaela for putting this together and extending the conversation that has been going on for a long time. In fact, Germany has a long experience of dialogue with memory and monuments and memorializing. So somehow I got brought into that discussion with Documenta, and I appreciate that I had the opportunity to make some little contribution, and I'm grateful to everyone who's sort of continued to talk about my own little contribution in the context of that conversation that's been going on in Germany for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You are now muted.
Contribution by a group of students who have been working almost since a year on tours or places, educational programs in the city of Hamburg that they will present to you tomorrow morning, and on interventions in the vitrines of this space. And it will be quick, but please bear with us for this last short moment when Lena Sandhof and Matthis Frickhöffer will just quickly present what you can see in the vitrines and what you can talk about with the students in a moment. Lena and Matthis, please join us.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Nora, for your kind introduction. Representing the student body of the seminar, which was mentioned before, we want to thank you all for your attendance and for the lectures and discussions and the dialogues. For the last 2 semesters, the seminar Gegen Monumente and Paramonumente, organized by Professor Nora Sternfeld, Professor Michaela Melián, and Nele Sock, Luisa Telles, and Julia Stolber researched the question, how and where does the city of Hamburg remember? We compiled our research and discussions now from the seminar to groups of 4 works on 4 different sites, questions on these different sites of remembrance in the city of Hamburg, which are displayed in this hall. Each work is connected with a city walk and a contribution to the Sternfeld magazine, which you can find outside of this hall as well.
So the first work you can find is behind you on your left. It's the Paracity Walk Africa House to Schiele House from Kervin Pere, with the question, who has the right to represent the other? On the other side, in the back, you find the Paracity Walk Bornplatz by Matthis Frickhöffer and Larue, with the question, what are the discursive consequences between space and people? To our left is the Paracity Walk for the Memorial Against Fascism, War and Violence, and for Peace and Human Rights, by the group of Jessica Herden, Sophia Leitenmayer, Cara Petrovic, and Janne Wagner with the question, what does a missing memorial show us? And to our right is the last one, the Paris City Walk Dam Tour by Imke, Eppelmann, and myself with the question, what can the Dam Tour monuments tell us about the culture of remembrance in Hamburg? If you are interested in the Paris City Walks, they will start tomorrow at 9 a.m. here at HFBK if you want to go there collectively, or at 10 a.m. at the individual meeting places you can find in the Leitenfeld on the poster. The groups should also be in front of their display cases right now, if they want to. So if you have further questions, I would like to know more about our work and the walks tomorrow, I'd highly recommend checking them out right now. Yeah, thanks for your time and have a nice evening.
So thank you very much, Lena and Matthis. And you are all now invited to maybe have a drink and also check out the 4 vitrines and also maybe visit our screening area with the movies. And then we hope you find all the way tomorrow to the walking Para-City walks in the city. So thank you.